So tonight, we've got a couple of great follow-on speakers. You're going to hear from another demographer. Obviously, Jim Hughes was terrific. His wit and witticism I thought was great. But tonight you're going to hear from Chris Porter from the John Burns Company. And then you're going to hear from Ellen Dunham-Jones, who is an academic and urban planner. And they both have a different perspective on things. I think what from Chris is co-author of a book, Big Shifts Ahead, which he's going to detail for you tonight, some information from that, which is going to lead you down the path of seeing what has happened generationally in this country, decade to decade, from both demographic changes, socio-economic changes, household changes, educational changes, and I think it's going to help inform that we are living in a different world and a different society today than we certainly were 50 years ago. And I think some of the images you saw on stage sort of showed that a minute ago, that the world has changed around us. Ellen Dunham-Jones, I think one of the greatest credits that she has is that she actually is a Jersey girl.
Absolutely.
And had family from Nutley. She is now the leader of Georgia Tech's urban planning and architectural group at Georgia Tech University. She is the co-author of a fabulous book that we're going to have for you outside. And by the way, I think we'll have Chris's book also outside, copies available for people. But I think what you're going to see there is a more practical case study of what has worked and what hasn't worked for specific properties around the United States, whether it was a defunct mall, an old retail, defunct office, and housing developments and the like, and how change was able to be effectuated in those areas that really reinvigorated the communities that they were in. So without wasting any more time and getting right into it, give a big hand to Chris Porter. We will ask you to just hold questions until the end of both presentations, and maybe we'll get some nice interplay going on between Chris and Ellen. Chris?
Well, thanks so much, Gene. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually have some Jersey ties too, so I'm really excited to be back. As a consultant to the residential real estate industry, my passion is really helping our clients to understand who their consumers are, who are the people that are going to be living in their communities, and who are the people going to be living in their communities in the future. What do they want in the next community? Because it's so important for us to get this right. As we're developing new communities, these are the places where people are going to raise their families. This is the place where you are going to live, where you're going to sleep, where your kids are going to grow up. And there's a lot of great research out there that can help us understand who the consumers are today and who the consumers are going to be of the future. And so what I want to do today is share with you some of the trends that we've seen as we've looked at consumer behavior over the years. A lot of the trends that I'm going to go through will help you get a little bit more understanding about what the future looks like from a consumer perspective. My goal today is to bring more clarity to the conversation about demographics. As Gene mentioned, this is such an important part of community development. Today, I want to give you an example of a new way to view the generations. We're kind of used to using the conventional boomers and Gen X, Gen Y terms to describe the generations. I want to give you a little different way to look at it, and I think this will help inform some of the clarity going forward. Next up, I'm going to show how those different generations have exhibited these huge demographic shifts, how they've changed, how they've accelerated, how they've slowed down or even reversed some of these trends. And then last up, I want to talk about this concept of suburban way of life, the idea of bringing urban conveniences and urban lifestyle to a traditionally suburban environment. And I think that is really the path of the future as we look at suburban growth capturing a greater share of household growth going forward. There's going to be some demand for that urban type lifestyle in those suburban environments. So I want to bring you some greater clarity on these points here today. So I'm a demographer, and I know that sounds really kind of boring, but there's a lot that you can learn about people by just studying historical trends in demography. There are some demographic trends that are actually quite predictable. I can guarantee that in 2018, every person in this room is going to be 1 year older than they were in 2017. I can tell you, at a national level, we're probably going to have about 4 million newborns in the country. It's been pretty consistent, about 4 million births per year. This is a trigger for household formation, for home ownership. You often see the birth of a first child or the birth of a second or third child as a trigger for somebody to move into a different home, possibly owning for the very first time. I can tell you with pretty great certainty that in 2018, we're going to have 2.7 million deaths in the US. This is a number that's been going up, and it's going to continue to increase as the oldest population gets bigger in number and starts to pass away. I can tell you that with pretty good confidence that we're going to have 2.2 million marriages in the US this year, which is, again, another trigger for household formation and for home ownership. But I also can tell you that we're going to have about 1 million divorces in the US too, which is kind of it's a weird way to think about this, but this is actually a positive for household formation in a way, because you now have one household suddenly becoming 2 households, right? So we're doubling the number of households. But these are some things that I think you can pretty much count on with confidence that's going to happen this year, and we can actually forecast into the future as well what these trends are going to look like. But there are some other things that aren't quite as predictable, and part of it comes down to just some confusion about some of the terms that we use. So I'm going to show you some examples here of what I'm talking about. There's a very handsome man on the slide on the left, and the handsome man on the right is George Clooney, right? So these are my parents on the left-hand side. They're 71 years old. George Clooney, 56 years old. My parents have 6 kids. They've got 12 grandkids, and we've got a 13th one on the way coming up in June. George Clooney just got married at the age of 55, I think, and they just had twins. We don't have pictures of them just yet. So what do these two groups of people have in common? Well, we're calling them both baby boomers, right? They're in very different life stages. And I realize that, okay, maybe George Clooney is a little bit of an extreme example of this, but how can you have a meaningful conversation about baby boomers when you've got people in very, very different life stages? My parents are retired. George Clooney is still making movies, still directing, still acting. This person on the left, that's my brother. His name is Andrew. And he's 37 years old. Person on the right, you may know is Chloe Kim, who just won a gold medal in the Olympics. What do they have in common? Well, my brother, he's married, he's got 2 kids, he's a successful lawyer in St. Louis. Chloe Kim just won a gold medal in the Olympics, right? What do they have in common? Well, we're calling them both millennials. And how can you have a meaningful conversation about the millennial generation and what they're doing when we're talking about somebody who's 37 and somebody who's 17, still in high school? As a total aside, just for the record, I think that a 17-year-old Chloe Kim would have much more success as a lawyer than my 37-year-old brother would have as an Olympic snowboarder. So our biggest problem that we see when we're having a demographic conversation, we talk about the demographics with our clients, is this generation definitions we're so used to. When we get a lot of questions about what are the boomers doing, what are the millennials doing, and it comes back to this whole thing, well, how do you define a millennial? You know, we've been used to defining the generations by births in the US. So we had the silent generation, we had the baby boomers, and pretty much everyone can agree on the baby boomers born 1946 to 1964. But then it starts to be a little bit more fuzzy. You know, how big is the Gen X generation? When does it start? When does it end? And the millennials, I mean, I've seen some generation definitions that are just all over the place. In fact, I'll give you an example of that. There's a wide debate about how do you define a millennial generation. There's a bunch of different press mentions of millennials, and you can see that they're spanning all the way from 1975 all the way up to 2010 for a millennial. Again, how can you have a meaningful conversation about that? If I look at the average of these, it's basically 1981 to 1998 is how most people define the millennials, and that's 19 to 36 years old today. Again, very different stages of life. We came up with an idea, let's create some better clarity around the generation definitions. And what we said is let's name them by the decade they were born in. So if you look at the population today in the US that was born here in the US, this accounts for people that have passed away, people that have moved away. This is sort of how the population breaks down in terms of the decades born. So you've got that big group in the 1950s, colored here in purple, that represents the peak of the baby boomers. Then you've got this dip there in the 1970s, the baby bust, right? And then we come back up to the 1980s and the 1990s, a bigger group, and you know those groups are going to get bigger, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But our traditional definition of generations is based solely on births in the US. It totally ignores the fact that 13% of our country was born outside of the US. So once you layer the foreign-born population on top of that, it starts to change the picture a little bit. That big dip that you saw during the 1970s, it's not as big a dip as it was, as it really is. 1 in 4 people born in the 1970s who live here in the US today was born in another country. It's 1 in 4, that's amazing. The youngest generations, you might notice that they don't have quite as big a foreign-born share yet, and that's just because people don't tend to move here to the US until they're in their 20s and 30s. So we're gonna actually see those generations get bigger, depending on what happens with immigration policy. But as big as they are today, they are only going to get bigger. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of a history lesson, kind of talking about each one of these generations, and then showing some trends that each one of these generations exemplify. And I think this is all going to lead up to the end, where it kind of helps tell the story of why we think that urban growth in the suburbs is going to make sense, or urban living in the suburbs will make sense. So the first group, the 1930s group, we call them the savers. There's 14 million of them in the US today. And this is a group that was born during the Great Depression. They learned the value of a dollar. They learned to save because they had to. That's all they knew. This group retired, I mean, they're in their late 70s to late 80s today. They retired very wealthy. And part of that was because, one, they saved, but two, they also benefited from a great economy during their working years. And so, during their working years, the 1930 savers experienced 2.4% annual GDP growth per year. That's pretty amazing. You look at every subsequent generation since then, during their working years, it's been less and less GDP growth. Now, the youngest generations, the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, they aren't yet through their working years, so we don't know how the picture is going to play out for them exactly, but they've been off to a very slow start thus far, and it's going to take a lot for them to even come close to 2% growth during their careers. Next up, we've got the 1940s group. We call this the Achievers. And I should mention, we wanted to give each generation a nickname that was positive, something they'd be proud of. We don't want to call, the 1970s group the slacker generation. That's not really something they'd be proud of to say. So it's a positive term, but it's also something that describes a shift that they led our society towards. And so we say that this group, the 1940s group, led our society towards greater achievement. So we call them the Achievers. They're in their late 60s to late 70s today. And this was the group that really kind of kicked off the baby boom. So the last half of them were born at the start of the baby boom. And because there were so many more of them in schools, in the workforce, when they first entered the workforce, they were competing for those spots in school. They were competing for those jobs, and it led them to be very competitive in nature and led them to greater achievement as well. There's about 27 million of them in the US today. This group was really the group that we saw leading the decline in the number of stay-at-home moms, or the share of stay-at-home moms. So if you look back at 1975, for women aged 25 to 34 who had kids under the age of 6, 48% of them were staying home and taking care of the kids. You look basically down to the 1960s group. So, like I said, the 1940s group sort of led this decline. By the 1960s, we were down to 24%. We're starting to see a little bit of an uptick again with the 1970s, 1980s group. But again, it certainly can't match that level of 48% for the 1940s achievers. It's a huge shift in the way our households are structured and just the way our day-to-day life goes about. Next group, the 1950s group, we call them the innovators. So think of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and their high school classmates as well. Let's not forget the examples that I'm showing you are among the most successful of their generation for sure, but they went to high school with a lot of people who didn't maybe achieve the same level of success that they did. This is the group that's going to be forming the most of the retirement population over the next decade. So they're in their late 50s to late 60s today. These are the group that are really retiring in droves today. They create a lot of the innovations and the companies today that are still around that drove us towards greater innovation. They were born in their childhood during the space race and became very excited by technology, created a lot of companies that are still around today and that really have driven our society towards greater innovation. The number of startup companies with this generation was an all-time high. It's even much higher than today's youngest generation. So as I mentioned, this is the group that's going to be retiring the most over the next decade. 2015, we had 48 million people in the US who were 65 years or older. By 2025, we're going to have 66 million people 65 or older. That's a combination of a big number of people born in the 1950s who are about to retire, but it's also the fact that we're living longer as well. And so that's a 38% increase in the 65 plus population in just 10 years. That's huge. It's creating new types of demand, and I want to show you a picture of Steve. This is one of my coworkers. He's a 1950s innovator, and this is his Harley. And really, Harley targeted this audience, the 1950s innovators, when they were building bikes, and they followed them throughout their lives. Well, Steve's now gotten to the point where he just is about ready to retire. he doesn't ride his bike anymore. In fact, he actually sold his bike because he just found he wasn't riding anymore. It wasn't suiting his needs. And so what's happened is Harley has realized that this group is kind of getting phased out of the bike phase of their lives. So they're looking at what is the next fastest growing population that we should be targeting. And for them, it's young women. So you're starting to see some big campaigns by Harley to target young women. It's an example of a company that's changing some of their thinking about the generations and targeting this next demographic group. So one thing, as I mentioned, this is the group that's going to be retiring in droves over the next decade. We're in for some really interesting changes in the labor force, I think. So back in the 1940s into mid-1960s, we were used to seeing about 1 to 1.5% growth in the working age population. So this is just not people who were going to work, but basically the people who were living in the US between the ages of 20 and 64, growing at about 1 to 1.5% per year. All of a sudden the boomers come along and they turn 20 years old, they sort of enter the workforce, and all of a sudden we're starting to see population growth of this working age population of 2%. And for the next several decades, we saw between 1%, 2% job or population growth in that working age population. Well, now the boomers are starting to retire, and all of a sudden that working age population starts to grow at a slower rate. We're basically almost going to be replacing one for one a 65-year-old who's leaving the workforce with a 20-year-old who's entering it. So this is going to slow job growth in the US. And what's going to happen is we're going to find that employers are going to be having to fight for the better employees, and they're going to have to pay them more. And so we actually expect, even though the job growth numbers will probably slow, we're expecting to see higher income as a result of that, simply because of demographics. The 1960s group, we call them the equalers, and this is a group that, as they made greater strides toward equality, one of the big ways that we saw this group shift was we had more women in this group go to college than men for the first time ever. So if you go back to 1970, when the 1940s achievers were going to college, 42% of degrees went to women. By 2016, today, 58% of degrees are going to women. And where did it change? It changed for that 1960s group, the equalers. So we've seen huge strides in women in the workforce, and really we saw that switch flip with this 1960s equaler group. Talking about college educations, back in 1970, only 5% of married couples, both of them had a college degree. By 1990, it was 12%. Today, 24% of married couples both have a college degree. That's huge. I mean, there's a big shift in our population and the way that our households are operating today. What's been really interesting with this group is we kind of look at what you consider your empty nester population, sort of 45 to 64 before they hit retirement. Used to have about 20 to 22% of them were renting a home as opposed to owning. What's really happened since the recession is we've seen that number skyrocket. We have almost 28% of what you'd call empty nester households renting. Some of that's they're forced to because of financial situations, because of the economy collapse during the Great Recession, but some of it's due to preference as well. And you actually start to see more and more of this group saying, you know what, I like the lock and leave lifestyle. If I don't want to have to deal with the maintenance of owning a home, I can let somebody else do it for me, but I can rent and I can just turn the key, go take a vacation, and I know that everything's going to be taken care of for me. We've seen a little bit of a dip back here in 2017, down to 27.6% rentership for this group, but it's nowhere near the 22% that we were seeing for decades. So this has been kind of a surprising shift, but as I mentioned, it's partly financially driven, but it's also preference driven as well. The 1970s group, we call them the balancers, and this group really was seeking more balance in their life than they saw their parents had. These are the kids of the 1940s achievers, the 1950s innovators, and they saw their parents who were workaholics, and they put their efforts into their careers, and sometimes at the expense of their families. We saw higher rates of divorce amongst the 1940s achievers, 1950s achievers than any prior generation. And this 1970s balancer group says, you know what, we want more balance in our life. We don't want necessarily the same kind of latchkey kid syndrome that we experienced for our own kids. And I know this generation has kind of gotten a reputation as being a slacker generation, this is kind of the heart of Gen X, but it's really, they're working hard. And what they're doing is they're working hard at finding better balance in their life. So this was a group that we think really got hit hard during the Great Recession when it comes to housing. So back, if you look at your 10-year high school reunion, you're 28 years old, And if you're born in the 50s, you're born in the 60s, you go to your high school reunion, you kind of look around, you say, well, how many of you own homes? It's about 35, 37%. For this 1970s balancer group, the mid-2000s, when housing was at its peak, their homeownership was up to 42%. So they were the ones who were kind of stretching. They were the ones who were taking out those subprime loans to get into homeownership. What happened 10 years later? They go to their 20-year high school reunion. Well, they should have a homeownership rate of, 61% or 63%, depending on which generation you look at. They're at 52%. That's a huge drop. So they were much higher just 10 years prior at the peak of the housing market, but in the wake of the housing bust, they're the ones who got foreclosed on the most as well. So they're a group that has been challenged. And what's really emerged for this group is the advent of the single-family rental home. So this is, a third of the renters across the country actually live in a detached home that they're renting from somebody else. That's a number that's been rising. And actually 13% of all housing today in the US is a rented detached home. We've heard a lot about this in the news from these these partners who are going in and buying up hundreds of thousands of homes across the country and fixing them up and renting them out. This group, the 1970s balancers, kind of embodies that right now. Maybe their credit got hurt, maybe they got foreclosed upon, but they've got kids and they want their kids to grow up in a house with a yard and in a good school district. Single-family rental home makes perfect sense for them. And so we see that as something that's probably going to continue. If ownership isn't for you, renting a detached home makes a lot of sense. We also saw this group kind of peak with the dual income households. So this is the labor force participation rate, the number for women who are out in the workforce looking for a job or are employed. By 1999, 2000, it actually peaked about 73%, kind of right around the time that this 1970s balancer group was finished entering the workforce. We've actually started to see labor force participation rate for women trend down for a number of years, even before the Great Recession. We think there was a shift that people said, you know what, I want more time with my family, more time with my kids, and I'm going to trade off the career for time at home with them. And so we've seen a little bit more of a shift towards single income households in those instances, really kind of led by this 1970s balancers group. Next up, the 1980s group, and these are the sharers. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. The 1980s sharers, they really have led the disruptive shift to a sharing economy. This is the group you think of Mark Zuckerberg, you think of the guys that created Uber, the guys that created Airbnb. And Mark Zuckerberg thinks your entire life should be shared on Facebook, right? This is a group that, more than any other generation in a long time, is sharing their home, either with a roommate or with their parents. They're living in their parents' basement. And they, out of financial necessity, but also just because it's smart. If we can share a car by riding in Uber, as opposed to having to own a car, having to make insurance payments, having to pay for gas, I'm okay giving up some of that ownership in lieu of renting or sharing. This is a generation that's been plagued by student debt, and this has actually quintupled in the last 14 years. As you look back to 2003, $253 billion in student loan debt. Today, we're at $1.38 trillion in student loans. And so you know that, it's been said before, this is a generation that is living at home more than any prior generation. This is part of the reason. They're more educated than any prior generation, but they have the student loan debt to prove it. So it's delayed a number of life milestones for them. They're slower to move out of the parents' home. They're slower to get married, to have kids. We still think they want to do that, but it's just going to happen a little bit later than it has for prior generations. We make the joke that 10-year high school reunions now are single parties. It used to be the case that you go to your 10-year high school reunion and maybe 18% of the people in the room were single and had no kids. With the balancers, it went all the way up to 46%. By the sharers, this group that created the sharing economy, it's up to 56%. So more than half of the people in your room at your high school reunion are single without kids. This is an example of one of my coworkers, Kyle, here on the right. This was his story. He lived with his parents up until last year. I think he just turned 30. And he made a quote in our book that he said, girls who've got their act together don't want to be with a guy who's still living in his parents' basement. And it rings true. But he was smart, and he took that opportunity to save some money. He's now possibly going to even be able to skip the renting stage altogether and go right from living in his parents' house to owning his first home. So I think as long as these sharers are making smart financial decisions, I think it's going to pay off in the long run. For them, it's kind of about the experience more than the possession, at least at this point in their life right now. And so that's part of the reasons you see some of them delaying home ownership. Getting close to the end. 1990s connectors. This is a group we call the connectors because they're constantly connected to the world, through their phone, through the internet. And they were kind of born during the advent of the internet. And they're just in young adulthood today, so 18 to 27 years old. But for them, the world is very small. They're so well connected to the rest of the world. This is going to be the group that is going to drive most of the household formation over the next decade. So as you think about, they're 18 to 27 today. 10 years from now, they're going to be 28 to 37. So as we look at our forecast for 12.5 million more households, net more households in 2025 than 2015, that's a result of, we're going to lose about 13.3 million households from generations that are going to pass away, but we're going to gain almost 26 million households by the younger generations, really driven by this 1990s connectors group. They're going to add 14 million households to the US over this next decade. And as we think about what does household formation mean, both owner, whether you're an owner or a renter, it really does create some economic growth. And so you think about all the things that go into a house or an apartment. I mean, you've got your kitchenware and your appliances, right? You've got furniture that you have to purchase. You've got pets. You've got subscriptions that you're getting. Entertainment, takeout food, and decorations. All these things are an economic engine. So it's not just the simple act of moving out, but it's all those things that come with it that are really helping to create some consumer spending in our country. Last up, the 2000s globals. This is a group that we don't really know a lot about them as adults because they're still kids. They're 8 to 17 years old today. But what we do know about them is, one, they're very well connected with the rest of the world, as I've talked about with the 90s connectors group. But these are also largely the kids of the 1970s balancers, who, as I mentioned before, 1 in 4 of them was born in another country. So if these kids weren't born in another country, it's a pretty good chance their parents might have been. So I want to talk about what we call the 4 big influencers that influence demographic shifts, and that's the government, the economy, technology, and societal shifts. All of these things are impacting the way that we live. I've shared with you a lot of the societal shifts that have occurred just in terms of marriages, in terms of education. What I want to talk to you a little bit now, just running you through some examples of what's happening. So from a government policy perspective, we had a number of laws passed in the 1980s and 1990s that really drove immigration to our country. And we went from having just 5% of our population that was born in another country in 1970 to more than 13% today. And it was largely a result of those laws that were passed during the 80s and 90s. So government policy has a huge impact on demographic shifts. Think about how the economy impacts each people or each group in their different life stages. So when the Great Recession occurred, the 1990s connectors were in childhood. And for them, it meant that they learned the meaning of the word staycation, right? They couldn't afford to go on a big fancy vacation because the budget was tighter on the house during the recession. For the 1980s sharers, they were in their early career, and while this is a more educated generation than ever before, we found more and more of them working in jobs that really didn't utilize their college degree as well as they probably would like to, which would be really important for them to help pay off their student debt. The 1970s group, the balancers, they were in family formation mode during the Great Recession, and for them it meant maybe they got foreclosed on, and that's when they moved into their single-family rental home. So there were some shifts there that occurred as well. You saw more of this generation start to actually do more of a single-income household. And then for the older generations, who were either in their late career or maybe in retirement, then they saw their 401ks just get demolished. And, well, they've largely recovered to this point. In fact, they're probably doing quite well right now. I mean, these are the generations that are going to retire wealthier than any generation prior to them. If they were counting on fixed income as a revenue source for them or income source for them in retirement, they've been dealing with such low interest rates for years. So it impacts each generation and each life stage differently. And the last step, I want to talk about technology and how this impacts each generation differently too. So I've got a 1960s equaler on the left-hand side, and he's probably used to using an ATM to get cash, right? The 1990s connector, probably his daughter, she doesn't know what cash is. She probably does everything on her phone, all electronic transactions. And I'm using some very broad generalizations here, but you get the point. The 1960s equal, he's not going to give up his car. No, he likes driving. He grew up in a car culture. But his daughter is perfectly fine riding an Uber. You know, there's the old joke about how our parents told us, never give your information to anybody on the internet and never get into a car with a stranger. And now what do? We got on the internet, we give all our information to a stranger who's going to pick us up in their car, right? Seems a little backwards. It used to be you have to go to a bar to meet people, right? And now you can just meet somebody by swiping left or swiping right on your phone. And in 1960s equaler, when he's going to buy a house, he's going to use a realtor. That's the first place they're going to go to. Although we see more of them go to the internet. But for the 90s connector, quite frankly, they'd be okay not having to talk to a single person. If they could do everything online, they'd be just fine with that. And again, some very broad generalizations here, but it's true. So huge technology differences between the different generations as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to just make sure that I cover this, but not real in depth. We think these four big influencers, as you kind of look at how they influence each generation and their different life stages, it really helps you to understand these questions about how consumers behave. What are they going to buy? Who are they going to buy it with, or who are they? When are they going to buy it? Where are they going to buy it? Why are they going to buy it, and how are they going to buy it? And it comes down to whether it's consumer goods or it's where they're going to live, you know, where they decide to purchase their home or where they decide to rent. I think as you look at how all these big influencers will change each one of these generations, it can help you get a little bit more insight as you kind of go through them generation by generation into how they're going to behave in the future. So I want to talk a little bit about how we think the population and the different generations are going to want to live. You've seen some of these societal trends and these societal shifts that have occurred over time, but we think this is impacting how people decide they want to live going forward. So if we take a snapshot of the US population in 2015, we said that 15% of households live in urban areas, 65% are living suburban, and 20% are living in rural areas. And if you kind of look at this on a map, this is the rural areas. It's huge, but it's only 20% of households in the US. And then you kind of get into what we call the more suburban areas. And this is the green areas on here. It's usually around a large metropolitan area, but it's not the city itself. And then you've got the 50 cities that we call urban within those big metro areas. This is kind of how America lives today. What's happened over the last decade is we've seen this huge pop in urban. So typically urban growth captures about 7 to 10% of household growth over a given decade. From 2010 to 2015, we saw this 21% capture of urban growth. We've not seen that in decades. And I want to point out, though, too, that the suburbs still capture the great majority of growth. It's 71% of growth is still in the suburb areas. But really, you know, going forward, we think that the suburbs is where the growth is at. Almost 80% of the growth over the next 10 years, we think is going to be suburban growth. And I'll show you why on this very next slide. Over the last decade, we saw huge growth of people in their 20s, and this is typically your urban living years, right? So when you're young adults in your 20s, you want to live in the urban areas and the big cities. We saw 4.7 million more people in 2015 than we did in 2005 in that age group. And then we've got the empty nesters, sort of the 55 to 64 age group. They grew by 10 million people, 10.3 million people in that 10-year span. And they, you know, after they want to sell the suburban home where they raise their kids and want to downsize a little bit, we've actually seen more of them go towards urban areas. So I think the combination of these two factors really describes why we saw this big pop in urban growth. It was really largely led by demographics. Well, what does this mean for the next 10 years? So as we look at 2015 to 2025, the young adults in their 20s, they're really not going urban. I mean, we're not seeing any growth in the 20 to 29-year-olds, and we're seeing only 655,000 people growing in growth in that category for the 55 to 64-year-olds. Oops. The real growth is in those next categories, and unfortunately it's not highlighting them, but people in their 30s and people in their later 60s in the suburbs. And they go to the suburbs because of school quality, and they want their kids to be in homes that they have a backyard in where their kids are in a good school. And so we think, you know, from a demographics perspective, there's a lot of impact on the suburbs in the future. So we created this term we called Surban, the idea of bringing the urban conveniences and lifestyle to traditionally suburban environments. We think it's something as these people who have lived in the urban areas in their 20s are now moving out to the suburbs. We think they're going to demand more of this type of lifestyle. So what is suburban? You've got higher ranking schools than you'd find in traditionally urban environments. You've got lower crime than urban. You've got that walkability and bikeability that often comes with the suburbs. You've got vibrant restaurants. You've got lower rents or home prices than you'd find in the traditional urban environments, but probably a little higher than you'd find in the traditional suburban environments. And you may or may not have public transportation. We think this is the way that the future is going, that we're seeing these small downtowns pop up, the urban town centers in cities all over suburban cities all over the country. So we coined this term suburban. We actually got a trademark on it. It's been picking up some pretty good press. We're hoping it catches on. And I'll just say it. It basically describes mixed use. But who wants to say that they lived in a mixed use community? Like, that just doesn't really kind of roll off the tongue. Maybe suburban doesn't roll off the tongue as well either, but I don't know, just the term mixed use always kind of struck me as a little bit odd, at least from a residential side. So some of the best conveniences of urban and suburban that the suburban area provides, you've got housing and affordability, home size, privacy, sort of pet and kid friendliness that are more close to the urban side of things. But then you start to get into the suburban with more open space, more restaurant and entertainment options. You've got more walkability, some peace and quiet, better ease of parking. And then your school quality and your public transit looks a little bit more like the suburban environments that we're traditionally used to. I've got an example here, but in the interest, I know Ellen's going to go through a lot of examples here, so I'm just going to actually skip through this. This is a community in Alpharetta, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta, that has incorporated this suburban concept. We're sort of bringing the urban to a traditionally suburban environment. They've got this town square, and I was actually talking with Ellen earlier about this today. She lives in Atlanta, and she said it's something that's been pretty well received. So I've got a couple more slides left. As I think about just sort of how people are going to want to live in the future, as this youngest generation becomes of adulthood, as they move out and form their own households, think about what this means for retail. We see societal shifts move retail towards more selling experiences than just goods. So this is a concept of an Apple store going forward, where they're trying to create community, not just selling products on the shelves, but really kind of selling the experience of creating community with those people who also buy Apple products, and you give them a little cafe area where they can sit down and converse after they've made their purchase. We think these suburban developments are going to replace shopping centers. This is an example of a mall near where I live in Southern California. It's kind of your 1960s, 1950s, 1970s mall. I think that's going away in terms of more of an experience, a walkable town center where people mix both the retail and the outdoor experience and getting to build some community with the people around them. We're really interested in understanding what's going to happen with driverless cars. I think this is the opportunity to open up some really prime real estate locations across the country. Spaces that are right now occupied by parking lots, that are occupied by automobile dealerships, by gas stations. I think these could easily be turned into sort of walkable communities, whether it's retail or whether it's residential, and it's prime real estate, because these were built so long ago when land was more available. I think as we think about the future of driverless cars and the impact they could have on real estate, there's some real implications there as well. We think suburban office demand that's designed for flexible work lives is going to return. I think there's this real impetus, especially by the 1980s sharers. This is a group that was really, really innovative, and as they are becoming senior management in companies today, they are entering their family formation mode as well. They're having kids a little bit later than their parents would have, than their grandparents would have, and they demand a little bit of flexibility in their careers and their working lives. And I think we start to see more suburban office growth as they move to the suburbs for the schools, for their kids. They're going to want to be close to where their kids are going to school. They don't want to have to drive an hour from their job to pick up the kid if somebody gets sick. And if both parents are working, by the way, that's two parents who are an hour away now. So I think we're going to see, well, we saw some office move more urban in the last decade or so. I think we're going to start to see more of that follow this generation out to the suburbs. And I think really municipalities can assist successful growth as well. We look at how governments have impacted the housing trends. I mean, for ages, that's been the case. And we've got state and federal and local governments passing policies and making investments that really have changed society in great ways. I mean, you look at how state governments, especially in the South, where they've got some very low income tax states down there, we've seen more of the growth shift towards the South. We've seen local governments really make investments in their urban downtowns and really seen a real urban vitalization. And I think we've seen some really, really astute suburban developers and planners take note of that and say, hey, as we're planning, we're zoning for our next communities, we need to incorporate this idea of redevelopment, of bringing retail, of bringing office, of bringing residential together in a form that really appeals to this next generation of householders going forward. So, I know that was a lot of information, and I probably spoke way too fast, but I'm hoping that there's some clarity that came out of this as we kind of looked at the generations and how they're different and how the things that have affected them in the past are going to impact their future. I hope I've exemplified some of these huge demographic shifts that our country has undergone, and it's continuing to evolve, and so I think it's important to stay on top of these trends. And I can just tell you, if you're not staying on top of the demographic trends, it really is, as somebody has said, demographics is destiny, and so there's a huge impact on our country. And then this whole concept of the suburban way of life, this idea of bringing more of the urban living conveniences and experiences into traditionally suburban environments. So with that, I thank you, and it's been really fun.
All right. So I get to follow that. Thank you so much, Chris. So let's see. So what I do, I maintain the world's only database, no one else bothers, that tracks what I deem to be successful examples where dead big box, dead malls, dying office parks, aging garden apartment complexes, commercial strip corridors, golf courses, branch banks, you name it, prototypical suburban property types that as they're aging, just like the generations, they're aging too, have been retrofitted into more sustainable places. So my co-author and I wrote this book I'm delighted that you guys are going to get some copies. When we wrote this book, we had about 80 case studies. Today, my database has about 1,500. That's without being very systematic about it. That's just kind of as I can find them. And because there's so much change happening. And it's basically because we built the sort of 1920s suburbs are these leafy, wonderful places that are going to hold value for a very, very long time. But so much of what we built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it's not aging very well. So, let me just hit the space bar. Right now, of the 1,500 properties that at one time or another were an enclosed mall, we've already lost 1/3 of them. And of the 1,000 that are left, probably we'll lose between 1/4 and 1/3 of those very soon. I already am tracking. I've got 265 there that are already or have been already retrofitted. Big box stores, strip malls, the numbers are too big to even count how many retrofits there are. The offices, the office parks, the corporate campuses, that right now I'm tracking 116 office parks. There's a whole bunch of another 100 or so kind of industrial parks. So there's a lot of change going on. Now, I'm not going to show you all of the case studies. It'll just feel like it, but bear with me. So because we have so many case studies, June and I categorize them. One way to think about them is in terms of 3 basic urban design strategies. So one of the strategies is simply to re-inhabit the existing buildings with more community-serving uses. So here's a New Jersey example. Down in Willingboro was one of the original Levitt towns, and this was their commercial strip. with a Sears and a Woolworths and various other chain stores, all of which had died. And so about 10 years ago, they removed one of the buildings, put in a town green, de-paved a good portion of the parking lot to capture and clean the runoff. The old Woolworths is now a library. There's a medical center in the former Sears. There's a community college. There's now some retailers coming. They made a town center, a truly local place now, for almost no money. I mean, basically just re-inhabiting the existing buildings. All right, so another strategy is regreening. Because frankly, we built a lot of this stuff, especially before the Clean Water Act in 1970, it was absolutely common to drain the wetlands, culvert the creeks, and just build on top of waterways. And over time, that worked for a while, but over time, you get more and more pavement upstream, we're getting more and more severe storms, and the culverts are failing. So that's kind of what happened in this example. Is that me? I know, I'm from Jersey, I talk with my hands. So this was a strip mall in Phelan, Minnesota, built on top of a drained wetland. And as you can see, both the strip mall failed and the culverts. The parking lot was perking. It happened to be on a major migratory bird route. And so for purely ecological reasons, they were able to get a very special grant. The local university helped them get a grant to reconstruct the wetland. And that was really all they were intending to do. But in the process, that created lakefront property, which attracted the first new private investment in over 40 years to a very, very low-income community. So often, actually, the regreening, which is, the regreening often has actually a very significant impact on adjacent property values and can trigger the strategy that most communities are really hoping for, which is the redevelopment. Redevelopment will not work in every case. I mean, if a mall dies, the first question you have to ask is why? Did it die simply because there was competition from another mall, but other uses might do just fine? Or did it die because the middle-class jobs that were supporting that mall have gone away? And so you can't redevelop. You're not going to have a market for intensification, urbanization on every kind of dead property site. But in many cases where you do have a strong market, then there's great opportunities to actually address all of those, the desire for that suburban lifestyle that Chris was just telling us about. So this is the very first of I've got, as I said, almost 300 dead mall retrofits. I've got about 62 in the database now. Dead malls that have become the new downtowns for their communities. This was the very first one of those. This was, the mall only lasted 15 years. It had competition from another mall. It just never really took off. When it died, the land defaulted to the city for lack of paying taxes. While the city owned it, the city said, we need more green space. So we want to see this redeveloped, but we want 2/3 of the land to be park and green space. So the design centers on a linear park, and then it's flanked on both sides with retail at the ground floor and apartments and offices up above. Since it was first built in the early 90s, it's been added to 7 times, each time at a sort of more luxury rate. It's been doing fantastically. It's now the second largest tax generator for Boca Raton. So a lot of communities that have dead malls are sort of saying, we want to do what they did. And that is, in fact, happening quite a bit. This is another example. This was a large, very large mall, 6 miles outside of Denver, Lakewood, Colorado. It was a 100-acre superblock site. Today, it's 22 blocks of walkable public streets with retail at ground and apartments or office above on 2 of the main streets, and then a range of different housing types, quite a bit of office. And it really is the downtown that Lakewood never had. It's been financially performing extremely well, generating about 4 times the property tax revenue of the mall at its peak. And they basically tripled density on the site. It's not super tall. It maxes out at about 4 or 5 stories. But because it has a really synergistic mix of uses, it ends up they didn't have to widen any of the arterials around it. They didn't have to add a single new traffic light because it captures 45% of trips on site. The folks who are living there are, most of them aren't working. How many of us really get to live and work, and especially in a 2-income family? It's rare that we all get to quite walk to work. But other than their work trip, they can handle almost all of their daily trip, kind of ordinary needs and errands on site. And they're loving that, because this is the folks, and mostly who's moving in, it's a lot of those sort of empty nesters, and it's also a lot of the young people. So the young professionals. I still use boomers and millennials, but I can't quite trip off the tongue with Chris's terms. Now this slide shows, so that project I just showed you, Belmar, is the red star there, 6 miles from downtown Denver. This is a map of the 13 regional malls in the Denver area. 13 of them have been retrofitted. So, and why I show this slide is for a couple reasons. One is to make it clear, not a single family house was demolished. There was nobody's existing choices of how to live were removed by this. All it's doing is it's now finding places in the suburbs to now allow the people who are looking for that more urban lifestyle, the growing population that Chris has just so beautifully described to us. It's giving them new choices and adding new choices to the Denver area. Now, what it does also show, though, is we sort of end up with these pockets of drive-to walkability. So if we really want to get the benefits of sustainability, one would also start retrofitting the corridors and really thinking about kind of potential for transit, which Denver is very much doing. And I'm not going to kind of get into all of those examples, but there's a whole lot of ramifications that are kind of the next steps. What I'm going to focus on is the ways in which we're now retrofitting the suburban workplace. So, key to a lot of economic development in general for communities is, if you can attract those 25 to 34-year-olds, that if they buy their first home, in your community, you attract them at that age, you've probably got them for a long time. So it's really key to make sure that you are attracting that younger cohort. And I know Jim Hughes spoke earlier this week about New Jersey is losing exactly that cohort. And that worries me quite a lot. So how do you attract that group? Well, again, in general, there's a lot of research on the millennials and Gen X, and most of it, again, if you think of this is the group that that taught us what the word multitasking really means. To be on your phone while you're doing something over here, while you're doing all those things. They want those mixed-use environments where you live, work, play. It's all mixed up. It is more urban. It's more stimulating. They're really used to that. They like that. They are the sharers, and they really love public space. Most of suburbia we love, in New Jersey, we love our private spaces. Who doesn't love their home? Do we love our arterial roads? Do we love Route 3 on, just the actual roads? Do we love the strip mall environment? That is our public space. And that most of this group grew up, most of today's 25 to 34-year-olds, most of them grew up in the suburbs, and today they find the suburbs boring. They want a more urban lifestyle, and they want active public spaces. They want, my theory, there's no proof on this, but because they spend so much time, and it's not just them, all of us, are now spending so much time in front of a screen. When we take a break from that screen, we really want an immersive experience. We want to be social, at least in a space with other people, or we want fantastic nature, or we want both. We want that other to the digital environment. And public space, really well-designed, beautifully public space, becomes incredibly important. Diversity of people and uses, kind of chance encounters. Again, these are urban phenomena that are now welcomed. And again, in the generational thing, I'm a boomer. I grew up watching Hill Street Blues and Law and Order, where the city is portrayed as a scary, crime-ridden, nasty place that has good, solid, public citizens who are making the world safer, and justice always wins out in the end. But the city was scary. The younger generation grew up watching Friends and Seinfeld, and the city is a fun and interesting place with quirky people, and that's what makes it great. And there's a certain amount of truth in both of those perceptions. The cities have really gotten cleaner and more fun. So urbanism has become the new amenity, especially for the workplace. The old, New Jersey, and I know Jim Hughes, wasn't here on Monday, but I've read his work, know him pretty well. I think he's done a great job of describing how New Jersey was really a leader in building the office parks of the 1980s, and we talk about the corporate campus. We use that word, the campus, because the assumption was that innovative research would happen if you put a scientist or an engineer in a quiet room with a window and a view of trees and lawn, very manicured. That's when the epiphanies would come through. Research has shown, and that worked. We got all sorts of really great things. But research has actually shown patents go up with higher density. There's a lot more recognition that innovation tends to actually occur through chance encounters, whether it's over the water cooler, like we all have water coolers anymore, but or it's in the street, or it's in the cafe where you're running into someone in the same industry. So the role of innovation, this desire for much more offline immersive experiences, is why we are seeing that Chris Lineberger is a professor at George Washington University who has researched how much walkability adds to real estate value. And nationwide, in general, it's about a 74% rent premium. So this is why, this is why there's just tremendous market demand. And the old model of the kind of what we grew up with here of the office park, the corporate campus, it still works for plenty of people, but it is yesterday's model. It is not what the next generation wants, and is why we are seeing a lot of those same corporations that fled the city in the late 70s, in the 80s, are actually moving back. So I'll show now a little bit more of how some of these office parks, how we're redesigning those suburban places to also provide these urban benefits. And especially what they really, you have to provide, I think, to be successful in the new model is walkability and a mix of uses that really allow people to multitask and to have that convenient kind of live, work, play. Because they've got to be, the generation that grew up driving, we all know, even if you love driving and love your car, you hate traffic. It's inconvenient. It is not the best way to get around when there's too much of it. So when walking is made the more convenient choice, and it really, if you're going to get density, that has to be what you're doing. You have to design that walkability to be a fabulous experience. And that takes really quality design. It's real, and I can't emphasize enough the importance now of, in order to make this work, you have to have residents in your office parks. Because if you think of it today, name how many office parks have really great restaurants. Enough said. As soon as you add residents, what happens is suddenly Joe's lunch place can now become Joe's Bistro, because it can stay open. In that it doesn't have to make its living only off lunch. It's now also been able to serve cocktails and dinner. Then they can start making a profit. They can start actually providing nightlife. Now we all know the suburbs were designed around an assumption that everybody living in the suburbs are young families with lots of children. And social life centers on the schools, and heaven forbid we allow alcohol within 100 miles. That's not who lives in the suburbs anymore. 2/3 of suburban households since 2000 have not had kids in them. And it's because, so it's a lot of empty nesters and a lot of young people, young professionals working, but not that many households with kids. And so you've got all these people looking for social life, and heaven forbid, a little, a drink now and then, some nightlife. And ironically, again, this is counterintuitive, but there are studies that have proven this very well. If you take your existing office park, even if you didn't tear things down as is happening on 3, but you densify it by adding some more residential buildings, you actually decrease the peak traffic. The total number of trips may go up, but you've given, because now once you've got, suddenly now you've got the dry cleaners, the restaurants, the gyms, all of these other things that give people a reason to not just, 5 o'clock, I'm out of here. You've given people a reason to linger. You've made a place people want to be. You dampen those peak traffic loads. So, and all of this has the combined impacts, you get these tremendous environmental, economic, and public health benefits of making it walkable and mixing those uses. So very quickly, just to sort of show how urbanism has become really this amenity for office. This is in Silicon Valley, Santana Row. This was a big strip mall and a couple of other sort of just fast food places. Today it's been redeveloped as a street. So, whoops, okay, let me go back. So it's been developed as truly, it's a really very dense urban street, and incredibly popular because there's nothing else like it around in Silicon Valley. So they made, it's really treated like an outdoor living room. as you get sort of further and further away from the arterial. Very, very high end. This is like the most high end retrofit that exists. So that first phase is what I'm sort of showing here, the mixed use, urban, street, and block. That very quickly attracted, and it was just surrounded by parking lots mostly, more residential. And then came the mixed use office and residential. It's now crossed the four-lane street, 3 million square feet of office going across the street because those folks can walk to lunch on that mixed-use street. They've now rezoned for urban village around, which is really quite unusual in the Bay Area. The opportunities to really leverage the healthiness of making a more walkable environment is particularly popular in some of the newer office parks based on life sciences. So here's one that's under construction right now in Nashville called One City, where it's former medical, it still has quite a bit of medical office as well as some medical lab buildings. They've removed some, kept some, and are just infilling it with urbanism, very walkable mix of residence, shops, and office. This is another example. This is Austin, Texas, about 12 miles out of the downtown. This is routinely referred to now as Austin's second downtown. So this was an IBM, this was where the Selectric typewriter was both designed and manufactured. I mean, the high tech of its day. And IBM sold most of the property. The first stage was on the lower left there, to basically build a piece of urbanism, a great street with retail at grade. They preserved some existing trees, worked around them, great restaurants, and then some apartments above. That then has attracted the second phase, which is now bringing in the much larger office that frankly you can't fit into the original downtown of Austin. So they're able to kind of, they're able to house the larger firms. But you know, this is happening all over the country. This is Crystal City in Arlington, Virginia. The upper left there sort of shows you the rather grim, you know, just you can't get real enthusiastic about walking into those buildings every day. But you know, that sort of was the 70s model. And they have a plan to dramatically increase and infill with a lot more residential. But the first step of what they're doing is they've added a thin little liner building of restaurants and cafes and retail at the ground level. And that has dramatically increasing the streetscaping, making it more walkable, making it a more attractive place to then, you know, and making it a more believable place to now start adding all that residential. The biggest, you know, we have these massive, you know, office parks. Research Triangle Park down in Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 7,000 acres. And today, you can't buy a cup of coffee in those 7,000 acres. You can walk in to any of those buildings and be given a cup of coffee, or, you know, but literally there's no coffee shops, there's no urban place. So, but they're fixing that. So they're infilling now. They've demolished part of 100 acres, sort of similar in size to here. Some of the buildings, and they're making now their real town center kind of, and putting in their innovation, incubation workspaces and things like that. Other communities, another big one, this is a 1,300 acre office park down in Richmond, Virginia, and they're envisioning over, they don't even say how many years, but decades, changing the zoning to be mixed use and to just infill and eventually, hopefully even ring with some form of transit. It'll probably be autonomous shuttle bus by the time they really get there. And we're seeing more and more now the public, a lot of these projects are being driven by the owners who are recognizing we've got to do something to attract the next generation and make our workplace a better fit for tomorrow's workforce. A lot of them are also being driven by the municipalities. Here in Fort Washington Office Center, just north of Philadelphia, a 500-acre office park built on top of 4 creeks. We used to do that. So it's been flooding like mad. So now what they've done is a transfer of development rights. So they're literally buying up the property and encouraging property owners to get out of the floodplains and then giving them land in the dry land to densify and urbanize the dry land and then bring in more of a mix of uses. And they happen to be right on the SEPTA commuter line, and they hope to eventually maybe even get a station. So other examples of kind of the public sector, I think Montgomery County, one of the most progressive municipal planning groups in the country, has been watching how just over time their share of suburban office jobs has been going down in their region, and recognizing, okay, we're going to incentivize infill. So they're now building townhouses and all sorts of other residential options inside, and this is one of the first ones. Westchester, New York, the Platinum Mile. I mean, for most of any of us who grew up around here kind of remember, the Platinum Mile was Class A office. But it isn't anymore. It's just these things age. So now the county have started a whole blueprint process, studies, how do you really adapt this for housing? They just broke ground on the first new apartment project, and they've also been bringing in academic anchors. So again, sort of similar to what we're seeing here. So Fordham University has moved into one of the former corporate office buildings. So getting into now sort of some of the smaller office parks. This example is in our book. University Town Center was a small, just 3 office buildings next to a mall and next to some 3-story garden apartments, and built very typical kind of 1980 sort of style. But then the DC Metro line was extended and a new transit station opened kitty corner to the property. So the owner of the office park said, oh, my surface parking lots don't make sense anymore. I'm going to tuck them under a hill and kind of work that out and insert a new main street in between my existing office buildings. And he also included then a lot more housing, grocery stores, Cinemaplex. Then the mall began to say, we might extend the street grid. The garden apartment complexes, several have already been redeveloped at greater densities. So you just sort of see, the urbanist in me loves this project. It's like, wow, they didn't tear anything down. They just infilled and made it more walkable. And one project kind of tripped the next one. Then I went to visit. The architect in me wanted to scream. They hired a strip mall architect to design their main street. This is designed with simple forms, no detail, no craft, big font, simple bright colors. It is designed so that you can read it in a car going 60 miles an hour. When you are designing for a walkable place, you must reward the pedestrian eye. You need fine detail, craft, touch, texture at that eye level, and really make that an experience that is better than shopping online. That experience is not better than shopping online. And although it's not sustainable, I hope it burns down. They could replace it and do a much better job. They got the urbanism right, the streets in the right place. They put the parking behind. All of that's really, really good. But the architecture is terrible. Design matters. This is the office park that all of my students at Georgia Tech, if they're going to work in an office, this is the office park they want to work in. This is creative office. So this is Taxi outside of Denver. This was a former taxi distribution lot. So it's basically where the taxis park overnight, and it's got auto body repair where they were fixed and that kind of stuff. It's since been, they re-inhabited the old buildings, fixed them up, recycled all the materials. You know, even the green space, you still see the striping of the parking lot. You know, it's got this authenticity to it. And then they also have new buildings that are hip and cool. The big amenity is the swimming pool made out of shipping containers. Every industry in there, you look at the signboard and it's bio this, digital that. I mean, this is all entrepreneurial, anti-corporate, anti-cubicle farm, anti-Dilbert. You know, this is what the next generation wants. Now, it's not what they're all going to get, but design really matters. This is another really interesting office park. This is Elevon, right next to LAX airport, and they advertise it as, you want a cubicle or do you want a courtyard? Now, they've got beautiful weather, it's LA, but you know, it looks residential. And that's not a coincidence. Would you rather work in a place that actually, I mean, this is the kind of, work doesn't have to happen at the desk. This is completely reimagining, really rethinking the workplace. So I want to just end with, again, just saying design really matters. So first off, you've got to design the network of the streets to be walkable. You want to connect with your neighbors. The new Rowan University in New Jersey, down in Glassboro, has just added a very large urban extension of their campus that connects the university to the little main street. That connecting with neighbors is extremely important. Get the parking in the middle of the block. You know, I mean, you can have some on-street parking, but get it off you don't want it in front. Streets should be really designed like outdoor rooms. If you think of the section of a street, sort of ideally, and this is really urban designer wonkiness, but you want the width to be the same as the height of the buildings on both sides. You want the buildings on this side to talk to the buildings on this side as if they're two rooms. You know, it's two sides of a room. That makes the street feel like it's actually designed for people and not just as a highway for cars. Parks need to be actively programmed. It's not enough to just say, oh, there's some green space. No, you need to actually actively program the yoga classes, the farmers markets, the concerts, the activities. There's some great examples using big LED screens to help program all these things. Lots of cool things one can do. And then the ground floor, I don't really care that much. I'm an architect, but the upper part of the building, I don't care nearly as much about as I care about the first 20 feet up and the 20 feet out. You get that right, everything else is fine. But you've got to make the ground floor pedestrian. You really ideally that's where you want your retail, the bakery, the smells. Crafted details, again, that reward the pedestrian eye, benches, street trees, bike racks. These are welcome signs. They invite people. You want people to be happy and excited. In more residential streets, you want porches, stoops, things that, again, that invite human occupation. And you want to build with enduring and authentic materials that provide a sense of place. Too often, because land tends to be cheaper in the suburbs, the buildings tend to be cheaper. And we build with materials that aren't going to last. We're going to be in this endless cycle of just having to replace them again. They look cheap. And if we're trying to actually make places more urban and more lasting, we need to also do that in the buildings, in the sidewalks, in the furnishings, and all those things. And just very quick, there's pictures connecting to the neighbors. activating the public spaces using big LED screens. This is the Mosaic in DC. They really did a cool job of, at the ground floor, they put all the boutique-y, small-scale retail that makes it very walkable. Everything, no store is wider than about 25, 30 feet, which is about how long it takes 3 seconds when you're walking by. That's how often you turn your head. Beautiful walkability. But then 2 floors of parking, and then Target is up on the top floor. Yes, we still need Target, but we don't have to have it at the ground floor. Lots of cool things. Last slide. When you look at these places, every one of these is a retrofit. These were all built in the last 15 years. These are not old places, but which ones look authentic and which one looks fake and phony? In my opinion, it's this last one here on the right, the lower right. They gussied it up. Too much signage, lighting, cheap finishes. It feels like a mall rather than a street. That's all I've got to say.